Welcome to the National Archives Know Your Records program. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney. We are broadcasting live from the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. We are pleased that you have joined us. Before we begin, for those of you watching on YouTube, I have a couple of tips for you. First, I would like to let you know that we are live, so you can ask questions at the end of the program by using the chat feature on this YouTube webpage. You will also find links to our handouts, which include the presentation slides. You will also find a link to live captioning. Today we are pleased to have John Deeben offer his presentation entitled Restoring the Brotherhood of Union, Confederate Pardon and Amnesty Records from 1865 to 1877. He will provide a brief legislative history of amnesty activity during and after the Civil War by examining the application process and resulting records of presidential pardons and congressional amnesty offered to former Confederates. Mr. Deeben is an archive specialist with the reference section of research services at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. John provides Old Army and genealogy reference assistance, orientations to research, and frequently lectures and writes about federal records of genealogical interest. Let's forward the slide here. He holds BA and MA degrees in American History from Gettysburg College, 1987, and the Pennsylvania State University, 1990. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker, John Deeben. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, now that the 150th anniversary of the Civil War is winding down, it seems appropriate to take a look at what happened in the immediate aftermath of the war. And one of the truly remarkable aspects of the American experience of Civil War is that in the spring of 1865, it did not degenerate into a vengeful bloodbath against the losing side. Yes, there were certainly those who wanted to seek retribution against the South, but for the most part, there were no mass trials and executions of Confederate leaders. Jefferson Davis did spend almost 2 years in prison, and he was formally indicted for treason, but in the end, he was simply released on bail and never brought to trial. In fact, there were no trials at all for anyone for the crime of treason. And the only Confederate official who was executed for war crimes was Henry Wirz, the commandant of Andersonville. So for the most part, the United States in 1865 stepped away from that moral precipice and followed a more lenient path to reunification, at least at the personal level. Now, when you get into the reconstruction of the state governments and the occupation of the South, that's an entirely different story. But we're going to take a look at the personal process of pardons and amnesty for former Confederates and the records that that process created. So we'll start with a little bit of legislative background. From the very beginning of the war, Abraham Lincoln was concerned about national reconciliation. He recognized the need to have a policy in place to bring the southern states back into the national fold if the Union won the war militarily. He realized that in the event that that happened, that we were all going to have to live together again as one nation. So Lincoln advocated a policy of leniency toward the seceded states to encourage their return to the national fold. And while the moderate Republicans controlled Congress in the early part of the war, at least up until the midterm elections in 1862, they passed two important acts that supported Lincoln's lenient view. These laws sought to distinguish some rebellious acts in support of the Confederacy that were lesser offenses that did not constitute outright treason. The first act was the Act of July 31st, 1861, and this act defines some of these activities as the preventing, hindering, or delaying by force the execution of any law of the United States, the seizing, taking, or possessing by force of any property of the U.S. against the will or contrary to the authority of the federal government, preventing by force, intimidation, or threat any person from holding any public office under the federal authority, and offending persons would be found guilty of a high crime punishable by a $500 to $5,000 fine or imprisonment, but they would not be guilty of treason. The second piece of legislation was the Act of July 17, 1862. This act defined the punishment for treason to be death or imprisonment for 5 years and a $10,000 fine, and it would be left up to the discretion of the court depending on the circumstances of the case. See, up until this time, treason carried an automatic death penalty, but now that was kind of taken off the table, and an option was given between death or imprisonment. Punishment for persons engaging in rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the U.S. or giving aid and comfort to any existing rebellion or an insurrection would be imprisonment for no more than 10 years and a $10,000 fine. And persons found guilty of such offenses outlined in the act would be barred forever from holding any public office. The act also authorized the president to confiscate the property and assets of rebel officers, and also Confederate government officials, state governors, legislators, and court officials in the South. And most importantly, Section 13 of this act authorized the president by proclamation to extend pardon and amnesty to former Confederate citizens. And this is very important because this reinforced the constitutional authority that the President of the United States already had to issue pardons under Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. So armed with this legislative ammunition, Abraham Lincoln issued his first amnesty proclamation on December 8, 1863. The proclamation offered general amnesty and the restoration of property, with the exception of slaves, to anyone willing to swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, the Union, and the abolition of slavery as mandated by wartime measures passed by Congress. So in other words, they had to accept the Emancipation Proclamation. However, there were certain persons who were excluded from general amnesty, and these included civil or diplomatic officers or agents of the Confederate government, anyone who resigned a judicial post under the United States to aid the rebellion, Confederate military or naval officers above the rank of colonel in the Army or lieutenant in the Navy, former members of Congress who resigned their seats in order to aid the rebellion, officers who resigned their commissions in the U.S. military to aid the rebellion, and anyone treating black soldiers or their officers in any manner other than as legitimate prisoners of war. Once 10% of the voting population of a southern state had taken the oath of allegiance, the population would be allowed to form a new state government that would be guaranteed recognition by the United States. This was Lincoln's famous 1/10 rule. A follow-up proclamation on March 26, 1864, defined further cases in which insurgent enemies were entitled to amnesty. It also excluded persons who were already in military, naval, or civil confinement or custody, and any such prisoners were excluded from amnesty, but they could still apply directly to the President of the United States for clemency, the same as any other incarcerated person. Applications for pardon could be made to any commissioned officer, civil, military, or naval in the service of the United States, or any civil or military officer of a state or territory that was not then in insurrection. Certificates of pardon were allowed to be issued, and the records relating to the oaths of allegiance were to be transferred to the Department of State for safekeeping. And the Secretary of State was designated to maintain a register of amnesty oaths. Well, the Lincoln assassination nearly derailed the pardon process, almost, but not quite. And although President Andrew Johnson at first appeared to be vindictive towards the South in the emotional wake of Lincoln's murder, eventually he ultimately continued Lincoln's policy of leniency, once again vexing congressional radicals. During the Johnson administration, there were 4 major proclamations of pardon issued. The first and the main one was issued on May 29, 1865. This proclamation sought to target individuals who did not respond to Lincoln's executive reprieve, or else those who were continued to engage in rebellion after December of 1863. It continued Lincoln's earlier exemptions and added several others, including individuals who voluntarily left U.S. territory to aid the rebellion, military academy graduates who accepted Confederate commissions, ex-Confederate governors, anyone who engaged in commerce raiding on the high seas or border raids across the border from Canada, owners of Southern property worth in excess of $20,000 who supported the rebellion, and oath takers who had previously accepted amnesty under Lincoln but then broke their oaths. These persons from these excluded categories had to make a special appeal for pardon directly to the President of the United States. The proclamation of September 7, 1867, dramatically reduced the number of exemptions from pardon, as well as the number of outstanding applicants, who now comprise mainly the highest level former Confederates, including the President, the Vice President, the Confederate Cabinet, foreign agents, military officers above the rank of Brigadier General, naval officers above the rank of captain, and state governors. Anyone who committed war crimes against Union prisoners of war, anyone who was already under lawful civil, military, or naval confinement, and anyone who was connected in any way with the Lincoln assassination. The third proclamation of July 4, 1868, extended general amnesty to virtually all remaining participants of the rebellion, except anyone, such as Jefferson Davis, who was already under indictment for treason. The most important thing about this proclamation was that it did away with the requirement for taking an oath of allegiance. And then finally, the Christmas Day Proclamation of 1868 offered full and unconditional pardon for the offense of treason against the United States during the late Civil War. So only 3.5 years later, after the shooting finally ended, the slate was wiped clean. So when we talk about the records that were created as a result of the presidential pardons, we need to understand the administrative role of the Secretary of State and the Attorney General, because both of these cabinet officers traditionally handled the administrative aspects of the president's pardoning power. Most of the executive edicts designated the Secretary of State as the chief agent to issue pardon warrants and to collect amnesty oaths. So the Secretary handled the paperwork regarding common pardons or those not requiring special appeal to the President. And he also filed the amnesty oaths submitted to the Department under the provisions of Section 13 of the Act of July 17, 1862, and the various proclamations up to 1868, when the Oath of Allegiance was abolished. Applications for special pardons under the exemptions of the Johnson Proclamation of May 29, 1865, required official review by the Attorney General. And the Attorney General evaluated these applications through the Office of the Clerk of Pardons, which was established on March 3, 1865. So, for the special pardon cases, these were held by the Justice Department up until the 1890s, when the case files were transferred over to the Adjutant General's office in the War Department for safekeeping. Therefore, when you're coming to the National Archives to do research with these records, you need to understand that the presidential pardons that were filed with the Secretary of State are now located in Record Group 59, the general records of the Department of State, and these are located at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. While the special cases that were reviewed by the Attorney General and then transferred to the Adjutant General are now located in Record Group 94, the records of the Adjutant General's office. And those original records are located here at the National Archives building in Pennsylvania Avenue. So we'll deal first with the State Department records. Most of these records constitute compiled lists of pardons issued or oaths received, but generally you will not find any of the original certificates of pardon, because these were issued directly to the individual, and the State Department, for the most part, did not keep a file copy. There's a general index to these pardons in entry 1004 in the textual records in Record Group 59, and these are arranged alphabetically, giving the name of the person pardoned, the county and state of residence, and corresponding volume and page number to the next series, entry 1005, which is the main series of pardons issued between 1865 and 1866 to both Confederate civilians and military personnel under the proclamation of May 29, 65. There are 25 volumes in this series, and each volume contains a separate alphabetical name index as well. Now, reflecting the sometimes redundant nature of record-keeping practices in the 19th century, there's also some supporting administrative records relating to presidential pardons that are included in entry 1006, requisitions for amnesty pardons. And these requisitions show requests that were received by the Secretary of State from either the President or the Attorney General for the issuance of pardons or warrants of pardon to specific Confederates. And then finally, there's also a single ledger labeled Record of the Disposition of Amnesty Pardons in entry 1007, which recorded general information about pardons, including the name and address of the recipient, the mailing and delivery directions and notations, the date that the original pardon certificate was sent, and the name of the person to whom the pardon certificate was actually delivered by the mail carrier. So here in this series, you can actually find some unique information that you might not be able to locate anywhere else. Regarding the amnesty oaths that were submitted to the State Department, there's also a general index to these oaths in entry 998. The oaths are arranged by volume and then alphabetically within each volume, and each entry in the index shows the name and the state of residence of the oath taker and the number and the date of the oath of allegiance. Now, the main series of amnesty oaths are those that were signed and submitted by a single individual in the series Amnesty Oaths, 1864 to 66, entry 1001. Arranged by state and then alphabetically by the surname, the oaths generally indicated the name of the oath taker, the place of residence, which often served as the location where the oath was administered, the date of the oath, and the signature. And sometimes the forms also contained the age, physical description, and the occupation of the person taking the oath. So you can often find some good personal information about these individuals. Another series of oaths for the same period relates to more than one person, and these are usually referred to as the multi-signature amnesty oaths in entry 1002. These generally include oaths of allegiance that were taken by groups of individuals before a Union official. These records are also arranged by state, then numerically by the number assigned to the oath. And in addition to the name, residence, a description, and a signature, the oaths often identified the individual's military unit within the Confederate Army, and then sometimes you can also find other miscellaneous remarks. So here's an example of what some of these amnesty oaths would look like, and this probably is the most famous one that we have. This is the oath submitted by Robert E. Lee when he took the oath of allegiance at his home in Lexington, Virginia on October 2nd, 1865. Lee originally submitted his application for a pardon on June 13th, 1865, and the oath of allegiance was the final piece of the puzzle that he needed to submit in order to get his citizenship back. But for those of you who are familiar with Lee's story, you will know that Robert E. Lee never did receive a pardon during his lifetime, even though the document on the screen suggests otherwise. And the reason for that is that the State Department, and more specifically Secretary of State William H. Seward, deliberately pigeonholed his application and refused to take it seriously, basically. And the story even goes that Secretary Seward gave away Lee's application for a pardon to a friend as a souvenir. And the Oath of Allegiance, the document that's featured here, it was pigeonholed among other miscellaneous State Department records and basically forgotten for almost 100 years until it was rediscovered in 1970 by a National Archives employee among miscellaneous State Department records. And because of that rediscovery, in 1975, Congress and President Ford finally pardoned Robert E. Lee, and they made that pardon retroactive to June 13th, 1865, when he originally submitted the application. So here's a very good example of a record that we have at the National Archives that has a unique history of its own in addition to the history that it documents. So those are the State Department records. Now we need to take a look at records of the Adjutant General's Office, and these are the records that were reviewed by the Attorney General. The main series of records are in the series Amnesty Papers in Entry 180 in Record Group 94. And the case files are arranged into three parts. They include case files submitted by persons from the South, persons from northern states and western territories, and unaffiliated persons for which there was no state or territorial designation. The records are generally arranged by state or name, and at some point in the past, National Archives staff created an all-name index for these case files. The files themselves include over 14,000 cases of individuals who submitted applications for special review by the President. And the case files can include a number of useful documents, including the original petitions, which usually contain information about the applicant, including their background, their activities during the war years, and most importantly, their attitude in defeat. Y'all can also find the signed oaths of allegiance that they had to submit as part of their application. And then there are often other supporting documents, such as recommendations for clemency from prominent witnesses and citizens, letters of support from friends and family, and endorsements from other government officials who could vouch for the petitioner's loyalty and good standing. And some of the files also contained instructions from the President or his designates regarding specific actions to take on a particular case. The oaths of allegiance that were attached to the applications for special pardons sometimes contained additional biographical data. Many of the forms indicated the oath taker's name, their age, their occupation, and their place of residence. All of the case files in Record Group 94 have been microfilmed in publication M1003, case files of application for former Confederates for presidential pardons. And the microfilm records have since also been digitized, and they're available online through both Fold3 and Ancestry, so they're very easy to access and to search. So we'll take a look at a typical example of what one of these case files looks like. And this is the file for Thomas C.M. Alderson of Lebanon, Virginia. The document that's featured right here is actually the envelope that contains the case file, and it gives you some basic information about the case. At the top you can see, it's kind of legible, but you can see a case file number, then the applicant's name, his residence. It gives you the date that the application was filed, in this case July 21st, 1865, and then it also gives you the date that he received the pardon, which in this case he received it on the same day that he made the application. Here is Thomas Alderson's petition for a pardon. And by his own admission, he says he, quote, honestly and bitterly opposed the dogma of secession. Of course, he had to in order to get his pardon. Denouncing it as a wicked political heresy. When many of the pro-Union citizens of Russell County, Virginia, opposed the South Carolina Ordinance of Secession in December of 1860, Alderson advocated a careful but patriotic response to the national political crisis, urging, quote, an adjustment of our difficulties upon conservative principles. However, his citizenship remained in limbo after the war ended because he fell under one of the exemptions of the Johnson Proclamation of May 29, 1865, which specifically was the one which excluded individuals who had previously held civil office under the Confederate government. And what happened was, in early 1864, Alderson accepted the position of a postmaster at Lebanon, Virginia, which effectively made him a civil servant under the Confederate government. Even though he claimed in his petition that he only took the job reluctantly, and he also took it to escape mandatory service in the Confederate military under the hated Conscription Act. But that wasn't enough to alleviate his case. So he had to apply for the special pardon. And as we saw in the document on the previous slide, he did receive his pardon the same day that he applied for it. Here are two supporting documents that were also included in the file, and basically these are letters written by citizens of Russell County writing in support of Alderson's application. And then it also includes his original oath of allegiance that he took. This is the front side of the document showing the actual text of the oath of allegiance, and then the reverse side shows that he took the oath at Lynchburg, Virginia on June 3rd, 1865, and it includes the signature of the Union official who administered the oath. Now, I mentioned earlier that these records have been digitized and they're available online, so I have a couple of screenshots showing you exactly how you can find these on Fold3 and how easy the search is. But I should point out first, if you're doing this type of research, if you're searching these websites at any National Archives facility, you can access them for free via the National Archives subscriptions to these sites. However, if you're searching these sites, whether it's Fold3 or Ancestry, if you're doing this at home on a personal computer, you need to have a subscription to the site to at least get to the actual documents. So with that in mind, if you're looking at these websites at a National Archives facility, this is what the homepage looks like for Fold 3. And then you just want to select on the historical timeline, of course, you want to select Civil War. And that will open up a publication menu. And then all you need to do is select a link to Confederate amnesty papers, and that will open up a state menu. So wherever your relatives were living, you click on the state. We clicked on the state for Thomas Alderson, and eventually you can drill down to a list of actual names. Okay, and then if we select Thomas Alderson's name, then it opens up a number of thumbnail images of each document that's in his file. So then if you click on any one of the images, then it opens up in the browser window. Okay, and then from this point, you can either print off a copy of the document or download an electronic copy to your computer. So again, it's very easy to search and to access the actual records online. Okay, so those are the records relating to presidential pardons. But we also need to say a few things about congressional amnesty as well. In the post-war years, Congress also played an important role in defining and extending amnesty. Opposed to the leniency of the presidential pardons, congressional leaders desired a more punitive condition for citizenship that restricted the political rights of former Confederates. And this is mainly because the radical Republicans who controlled Congress at this time, they wanted to be in control of Reconstruction. So they successfully implemented this idea as part of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was adopted on July 9, 1868. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment specified and specifically prohibited anyone, but especially former politicians and public officials who engaged in rebellion, insurrection, or treason from holding elected office at either the state or federal level. This restriction effectively barred many ex-Confederates from political life in general, and more specifically from participating in the reconstruction of their respective states, which allowed the radical Republicans to bring in their own people to be in charge. And this opened up the whole issue of carpetbaggers and all that sort of thing. However, upon making a personal application to Congress, such political disabilities, as they were referred to, could be lifted by a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. So there was a way out. And this was the process that was set in place until May 22nd, 1872, when Congress passed the General Amnesty Act, which finally restored the right to hold public office to all but a few former 100 Confederate officials. So to facilitate this process of applying directly to Congress, both the House and the Senate set up select committees to deal with the paperwork. In the House of Representatives, they used the Select Committee on Reconstruction, which had already been established on July 3, 1867, to deal with conditions in the defeated South and to develop policy to facilitate the return of the former Confederate states to the Union. It had been created as a successor to a joint committee on Reconstruction, which had been formed in December 13, 1865, but it was not renewed at the beginning of the 40th Congress in March of 1867. And then after the passage of the 14th Amendment, the Senate established its own select committee on the removal of political disabilities on March 20th, 1869. Now, at times, in addition to these two select committees, at times, both the Committee on the Judiciary in both the House and the Senate also dealt with amnesty petitions, because those committees also held broad jurisdiction over matters relating to the civil and legal rights of U.S. citizens. So especially in the Senate records, you can often find amnesty petitions dating before and after the time span of the Select Committee in these records of the Judiciary Committee, and then that were referred later to the Select Committee, and then after the Select Committee was disbanded, then they were referred once again to the Judiciary Committee. So when you're looking at the congressional records relating to amnesty to former Confederates, you want to take a look at the committee records for both select committees and the Committee on the Judiciary. In all other respects, the congressional amnesty petitions are very similar to those relating to the presidential pardons. They include petitions which have narratives of wartime activities that demonstrated loyalty to the Union or resistance to Confederate authority or repentance of Confederate allegiance after the war ended. And as well, you can also find supporting correspondence both for and against the applications for relief. Now, amnesty petitions submitted to the House Select Committee on Reconstruction are going to be located in Record Group 233, Records of the U.S. House of Representatives. The main series within the RG 233 is the series of petitions and memorials that were referred directly to committees. This is a very large series. It's arranged by Congress, and then within each Congress, the records are arranged by committee. And then the records for the Select Committee on Reconstruction are arranged alphabetically by the name of the petitioner. However, some petitions, for whatever reason, never made it to the Select Committee, but instead ended up being filed among the records of congressional private claims that were also submitted to the House of Representatives. And especially in the House, private claims that were submitted during the period of Reconstruction were often filed in spite of any specific committee referrals in a separate series of records called the accompanying papers file, which again is a huge series of records. It's also arranged by Congress, and then within each Congress, the records are arranged alphabetically by the name of the petitioner. So when you're looking for amnesty petitions in the House of Representatives, you want to look at both of these sources, the series of petitions and memorials and the accompanying papers file. And here's an example of what you might find if you're looking at these records. This is the petition submitted by General George Pickett to the House of Representatives during the 43rd Congress on April 29th, 1874. And this file was one of the ones that was filed with the accompanying papers file rather than with the committee papers in the petitions and memorials. You can see this is the only document that's in Pickett's file, and you can see it's very blunt and to the point. I think by this time, probably General Pickett assumed that everybody knew who he was and what he had done during the war, so he didn't explain himself and the circumstances of why he needed to have his political disabilities removed. He simply submitted this simple statement saying, "I have the honor respectfully to request that my political disabilities may be removed," period. And apparently there was very little discussion or opposition to this, because a little more than almost 2 months later, on June 23rd, 1874, a House resolution was submitted to the floor of Congress granting Pickett his request to have his full political rights restored, and it was approved unanimously. There was no discussion. So those are the House records. Now, the amnesty petitions that were submitted to the Select Committee in the Senate are going to be found in Record Group 46, Records of the U.S. Senate. Now, all of the amnesty petitions on the Senate side, whether they were submitted to the Select Committee or to the Senate Committee on the Judiciary, have all been collected together and reproduced in National Archives microfilm publication M1546, petitions submitted to the U.S. Senate requesting removal of political disabilities. So they're arranged by Congress, and then depending on the Congress, they're either arranged alphabetically by state and then by surname, or they're in chronological order by the date that they were referred to the Select Committee. As far as I know, at this point, there is no index to these records, and they have not been, at least a microfilm publication or version of them has not been digitized or made available online. So I'll show you an example of what the Senate case files look like, and you'll see that they're actually very similar in nature to what we saw for the presidential pardon case files. So this is the case for Orrin C. Horn, who submitted his application to have his political disabilities removed to the Senate during the second session of the 41st Congress. And according to the envelope here, which contains the case file, his application was referred to the Select Committee on July 11th, 1870. Here is Orrin Horn's three-page petition to the Senate. And basically, he explains his circumstances during the war, and his case is very similar to Thomas Alderson's. At various points actually, he served as a postmaster, he served as a justice of the peace, as a justice of the inferior court, and he was also a colonel in the Georgia militia. So all these things worked against him and resulted in him losing his political rights after the war ended. So all this information is what you can learn from his petition. His file also contains a few supporting documents. In this case, this is a letter written by Horn to Senator William Sprague, and he's actually writing a follow-up to see what the status is of his application. Now, in some of these case files, it's interesting to note that you can actually find pre-printed petitions which provide just a generic application for amnesty, and then all the applicants, all they really had to do was sign their names, and date the form. So this is an example that I found in William Hudson's case file that was submitted in 1871. And here, in these instances, you really don't get a lot of personal information about the applicants because they're just relying on, as I said, they're relying on a standard form with a generic statement, and they just signed it and date it, and there's nothing else. Here's another example of a similar form from the case file of William Cadew from Randolph County, Georgia. Now here you do get a little more information because this form provides some blank space where you can add some information, and here William Cadew did note that he had served at one point as a justice of the peace, and he also served in the Georgia militia. So there you do get a little bit more personal information about this particular applicant. So those are the records that we have that deal generally with the Congressional Amnesty. To start wrapping things up, I just wanted to point out a few areas where you can find additional or related records to pardon and amnesty of former Confederates. One source is Record Group 393, Records of U.S. Army Continental Commands. And the main reason for this is that the local provost marshals who were operating in the occupied South after the war, depending on the military jurisdiction, the provost marshals were often local officials who received the pardon applications from individuals, and they administered the oaths of allegiance. So often, depending on whether you're looking at the records of a military department or a district or sub-district, or even the records of an individual post or other military installation, sometimes you can find under the provost marshal records, you can find registers of applications for pardon and lists of oath takers. Because in addition to receiving these records and then forwarding them on to the State Department, the provost marshals kept records of their own about these activities. And then here I have just a small sampling of some of the local jurisdictions where I did find actual lists of individuals who came in to take the oath of allegiance, including Fort Union, New Mexico, Fort Smith, Arkansas, and the post at Raleigh, North Carolina. So if you know where your relatives were living in the South after the war, and if you want to do a little bit of legwork, you can go to the specific records here in Record Group 393 of a specific military command and see if there are any provost marshal records that show whether they actually came in and took an oath of allegiance or submitted an application for a pardon. Another source is in Record Group 109, the War Department collection of Confederate records. Here we have a number of records that were compiled by U.S. military authorities that documented loyalty oaths that were administered to both Southern civilians and military personnel. Most of these records were compiled or maintained by the Commissary General of Prisoners in the Union War Department. And then after the war, he consolidated these records with other captured material from the Confederate government. And that's how these all came to be part of the War Department collection of Confederate records. Here we have two general series that you might want to take a look at. Entry 204 is a general register of Confederate prisoners and deserters who were released from confinement upon taking an oath of allegiance. And the register shows the name of each prisoner, their rank and their military unit, their place of residence, a personal description, the date and place where they were captured or deserted, and the date and place of their release after they took the oath of allegiance. And then the other series is entry 213, which contains lists of individuals either taking the oath of allegiance or paying a bond to secure their release from prison. And the lists identified the name and a residence of the person. And for those individuals who are posting bond, the entries also show their length of confinement, the amount that they paid to gain their release, and the name of the surety who guaranteed their bond. So there again you can find, this is one instance where you might be able to find a little bit different information that you might not be able to locate in any other source of records. Also in Record Group 109, Quite often, Union military prison officials also administered loyalty oaths to Confederate prisoners of war. And these records, most of the records that we have relating to Union prisons that relate to Confederate POWs have been gathered together and microfilmed in publication M598, selected records of the War Department relating to Confederate prisoners of war. So here, a lot of the different military prisons, such as Alton, Illinois, and Camp Morton, Indiana, and so forth, they often kept registers of individuals or prisoners or inmates, and oftentimes you can find in their notations whether or not an individual prisoner was released upon taking an oath of allegiance. But more often, a lot of these prisons kept specific records relating to the administration of loyalty oaths, such as Johnson's Island, Ohio, which kept a register of amnesty oaths, and Point Lookout in particular kept a lot of records relating to oaths of allegiance, because Point Lookout was one of the principal locations for recruiting volunteers for the U.S. Volunteer Infantry, which were otherwise known as the Galvanized Yankees. And if you're not familiar with who the Galvanized Yankees were, they were former Confederate prisoners of war who took the oath of allegiance and served in the Union Army in order to get out of prison. However, instead of sending them back to the battlefield, once they were released and they were in the Army, they didn't send them back to the battlefield to fight against their former Confederate comrades. They shipped them out west to fight the Indians on the frontier. But here again, you can find lots of information relating to oaths of allegiance to these former Confederate POWs. So here's an example of a general register of prisoners. This is from Camp Chase, Ohio. And as I mentioned, if you look on the right column in the remarks column, for individual prisoners, you can often see notations saying whether or not a prisoner was released upon taking an oath of allegiance, and it will give the date of the oath. Here's an example of a register from a general register of prisoners from Camp Morton, Indiana. And here you can see there are quite a large group of prisoners who were all released at the same time upon taking an oath of allegiance. This group of prisoners here, and then down below, most of the prisoners on this page actually were released en masse after taking an oath of allegiance on January 2nd, 1865. Here's an example of records from Point Lookout. This is from the Register of Oaths of Allegiance that were administered. So on this document, at the top, you can get the text of the actual oath, and then down below it, it gives you the date that the oath was administered, the name of the prisoner, and then the name of the Union official who administered the oath. And Point Lookout also has a very interesting descriptive list of soldiers who took the oath of allegiance at the end of the war. And this gives you a lot of good personal information about each of these individuals. If we look at one example that's highlighted here, this is what we learn about this particular prisoner. His name was L. McCurdy. It gives a personal description. So we learn that he has white complexion, brown hair, blue eyes. He's 5'8". He's originally from DeSoto County, Mississippi. He was a painter in his civilian occupation. He was released from Point Lookout on June 29, 1865. He was a sergeant in Company E of the Confederate Marine Corps, and he was captured at Fort Fisher on January 15, 1865. So there in that one source, you can find a lot of good information about particular soldiers. And then finally, the last source to note is that oaths of allegiance can also be located in Record Group 105, records of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, which is more generally referred to as the Freedmen's Bureau. In regards to property that was abandoned or confiscated by the military during the war, the Johnson Proclamation of May 29, 1865, restored full rights of ownership, with the obvious exception of slaves. So here we're mostly talking about real estate property. However, Southern landowners who wished to reclaim any of their abandoned or confiscated property also had to provide evidence to the Freedmen's Bureau of their loyalty to the Union. So the Assistant State Commissioners and the field offices of the Freedmen's Bureau processed these case files relating to the applications for the restoration of property. And as part of the application process, proof of loyalty, including either the original or a copy of an amnesty oath, had to be submitted as part of the application. So in many of these field office records and the records of the state assistant state commissioners, you'll find these amnesty records as well. And most of the oath registers that were kept identified the oath taker by name, by their county of residence, and often included their age, their occupation, and the date that they took the oath. So again, you can get some good personal information. Here is an example of an amnesty oath that was submitted to the field office at Memphis, Tennessee by Thomas H. Williams on May 18th, 1865, and you can see it looks very similar to the other amnesty oaths that we've seen in the presidential pardon records. And then also, here is a register of individuals who took the oath of allegiance at the field office in Dyersburg, Tennessee. And again, it lists the name of the individual coming in to take the oath. It provides a sworn or notarized statement attesting to the fact that he took the oath of allegiance before the appropriate official, and then it gives you the date that he took the oath. So again, it gives you a lot of good information about these individuals coming in to declare their loyalty to the Union, to the Freedmen's Bureau records. Okay, so these are the records that we have here at the National Archives relating to Confederate pardons and amnesty. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Did the person have to apply in the state where he owned property to get an amnesty, or could he apply anywhere, any state?
The records really don't make that kind of a distinction. It generally refers to where they were living at the time that they made an application. But I would generally tend to assume that for the individuals who were applying to get confiscated or abandoned property back, that they were making an application in that state. So you're referring specifically to the Freedmen's Bureau records in that instance?
Well, I see that all these records are organized by the state where the person applied. Mm-hmm. And so if the person didn't apply in the state where he had been living but had moved to another state, as many did.
Yeah, it generally refers to the state that they were residing at the time that they made the application. At the time of the Civil War. Yeah, even if they had lived somewhere else during the war, wherever they were at after the war, when these circumstances were put into effect, that's where they made the application from.
And just a question out of curiosity, at Appomattox, when General Lee surrendered, were his soldiers paroled or pardoned?
They were paroled.
And was there a list kept of the ones paroled?
There were, and those I've seen that list recently, and I just can't remember where I saw it. But they're not part of these records. They're separate records. But we do have those list of paroles. Yes. And
they would subsequently have to go through the pardon process.
Yes, if they wanted to reacquire, it would depend on their circumstances. If they qualified for a general pardon, or if they had to make a special application. But either way, they had to go through the process to get their citizenship back.
And just one last question. So after 1872, with the General Amnesty, nobody had to apply for anything anymore?
No, as far as I'm aware, after Congress passed the General Amnesty Act, that pretty much cleaned the slate. And nobody had, for the political disabilities that they were undergoing up until that time, and then also the other pardon issues had already been taken care of by the last amnesty proclamation of 1868. So by 1872, the entire slate was wiped clean.
So that's probably when General Jubal Early returned from
it may have been.
Mexico.
I don't recall his specific circumstances, but it may have been.
Thank you.
If we don't don't have any more questions from our on-site audience. I have a question here from Jan Murphy. She's been following along with us online, and she tells me that she has a lot of variations in her family's surname, so she's hoping that you can do a search by town. So her question is, can any of these record groups be searched by locality within a state, or are all the finding aids by surname?
Generally, all the finding aids that I have seen for the different records, whether you're working with the pardon record, the presidential pardons, or the State Department amnesty records, or even the congressional records, it's all by name. It's not organized either by state and then by name, but not by town or locality. Yeah. So if you're uncertain about the spelling of a name, generally, just to cover all the bases, you want to check under all the variations that you can think of. That's probably the best advice.
Thank you, John. Do we have any more questions online or from our on-site audience? Thank you so much for joining us today. John, that was very informative. Thank you so much.
Right, you're welcome.
And that concludes our program today.